Everyone. Welcome to the STOA. Is the Internet a Stage? This is a co-hosted session with Internet historian, analyst Katherine Dee, aka Default Friend. And if you're coming from the STOA audience and you haven't heard of Catherine's work, I definitely recommend you checking it out. She's always on point with her commentary, and I love her Substack. And recently, Catherine reached out to me and said, "Hey, let's do something." And then we were kind of sensing into what that could be, and the session emerged. A session which is going to explore collectively with us, is going to be a participatory session. Is the Internet a stage? And so the reading material was by Sherry Turkle, which is a joint influence of Catherine and myself. And we're going to off Sherry's work, Catherine's going to do a brief presentation, and then I'm going to follow up with a brief presentation, and then we'll have some kind of shares, Q&A, and then we're going to morph into a collective inquiry, which I will discuss how it's going to look after our presentations. With that being said, good to have you all here. Catherine, good to have you back at the STOA. I'm going to tag you in. Feel free to introduce yourself however you like, and then, yeah, we can start the presentations.
Hey, see a lot of familiar faces here. I'm a blogger, uh, somewhat of an internet historian, somewhat of an internet anthropologist. Yeah, and I just hope this is a fun, open conversation. I'm sure Clinton will have a bunch of notes for what we say. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to everyone.
And so you want to present now, Catherine?
Sure, let me see. Share screen options. All right.
And if anyone
Okay.
has any questions, kind of hold on to them, put them in the chat, and then we'll get to the questions after both presentations are done.
All right, so the question we're exploring today is if the internet is a stage. There's many ways to interpret that, and this is going to be my interpretation of that question. So that's something to think about too. There's not one interpretation of the question, is the internet a stage? So I'm going for the sort of, obvious answer through the lens of theater. Um, the internet, so it blurs the lines between reality and performance. It's a place where we engage in collaborative storytelling and role playing. And I see the internet as somewhere in between literature and theater. It's not the performances we participate in on the internet, certainly feel distinct from the other types of social performances. Um, one thing I thought of sort of immediately when I was preparing this presentation is, well, what's the difference between our work persona and say our internet persona or personas? So one of those major differences is that online interactions create this white space that's similar to literature and theater. Um, it allows for like much more speculation and interpretation than I think the types of speculation and interpretation we engage in person in-person interactions. We're suspending our disbelief in many ways, and this gives us a lot of opportunities, particularly to lie or misrepresent ourselves or to brand ourselves properly. I think this is a lot of where like the emphasis on vibes comes from. Um, and this white space is not, I think it's not as appreciated as it should be. Um, and I also think that at least outside of the realm of performance studies, we don't really think about the white space that we encounter in the theater as often either. Um, One way to think of this, if you're like, well, we see people on a stage, like how does this relate? Um, if you're watching, let's say, someone do improv and they're in plain clothes and they don't have physical props, they may, evoke something, or they may be, acting as though they're in Renaissance England or something. And we believe them. And if they do their jobs correctly, we stay in the show, so to speak. And if they don't, we're taken out of it. We don't believe them. And I think that this is something that we really see in our online interactions too. Um, it's not enough that we know for a fact that someone is physically attractive. For example, there's a vibe of being physically attractive. There's a vibe of someone being a man or a woman. There's this believability that is so much more pronounced online than it is in person. Um, there's another sort of more obvious, more on the nose way of interpreting this, and this is where the Wired article comes in. Sherry Turkle talks a lot about experimenting with multiple identities and this more explicit form of role playing, either for self discovery, catharsis. There's also people who are sort of explicitly playing a game. Um, and again, this idea of there being more space to be creative, to experiment comes in. The other part of it is we're both audience and performer simultaneously, which is sort of interesting. Like it's very participatory. So the type of theater it is would probably be close for the if you're accepting if you're a lurker is closer to something like Sleep No More than it is traditional form of theater. But even in Sleep No More, which if you're not familiar with it, it's you're watching a performance as you walk through a physical space, and you're both part of it and not part of it. It's sorry, I lost my train of thought, heard my son cry. Apologies for that. But anyway, long way of saying, it's very similar to a theatrical performance, but more similar to one where you're actively participating, even if you're not always playing a larger role. There's a final way that it's similar to theater, which is there's a catharsis through expression, and this is something that I've thought about a lot. I suspect that we've started processing our emotions both through consuming and creating media, and we almost for some people we almost need to filter it through media because um, we're so used to this process, right? So here are a few examples. Framing personal experiences as movie plots, um, having to see yourself in video crying or expressing an emotion as a way of understanding which emotions you're experiencing. I don't know how many people record long voice memos and send them to their friends, but I think it's pretty common for people to listen back to these voice memos. And I think it's important that people are creating these media artifacts. And it's very similar to the type of catharsis that we're experiencing through other forms of media, with the exception is we're also participating in it. And yeah, that is my presentation, and I will give it to Peter.
So thank you, Catherine. Give a little round of applause. For those who are just arriving, Catherine's presenting, I'm presenting, and it might be good, Catherine, you and I have like a little exchange because there's some stuff I want to ask you, and then we're going to have a brief Q&A. So feel free to pop your hand up or save a question during that portion. Now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, cool. And Catherine, if you can let people in. So is the internet a stage? I'm just going to start from the assumption that it is. So I'm not going to argue if it is or isn't. It's something we can discuss during the group portion. But let's just take this metaphor or reality of this the stage-like essence of the internet as true. And so what is a stage? The etymology, I looked up etymology dictionary, a place for standing, raised platform used for public display, platform for speakers, performers, or presentation of a play. And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the performers. And referencing the work of Sherry Turkle. She coined this term called the second self. Um, and I'm going to argue that this is how we perform. We perform through our second self on this stage of the internet. And the second self is an individual's online identity, which evolves alongside their offline self and increasingly acts as an extension of it. Um, and one second selves through Twitter, X, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Substack, all the usual suspects for in Web 2.0. So it's like your digital avatar. It's not really you, but it looks like you, and people think it's you. And it's a performance of you, whoever you are. And there's just the feedback loop, the second self feedback loop. So there's your real self, IRL self, and then there's your second self, which is usually scintillating if you're trying to get an audience. And then there's other people, which could be your audience, which could be your community, your critics, bots, whatever psyop is happening against you. This is the catch-all for other people. And in theory, this is a feedback loop, right? Your real self influences your second self, and your second self influences your real self, and then your second self is like the mediator between all these other people on the internet that you're interacting with, and then there's a dual interaction there. Um, and but sometimes there's a sense that it only goes one way, and there's something called creator stadiums. Which some people coined. So basically, some kind of podcaster or content creator creates a second self, or they're not even aware of their second self. They're just sort of like enmeshed, their real self and their second self, and they create, and then it influences other people. And so that's just sort of like this sense of a one-way direction of influence, which is rarely the case. And oftentimes, if you're on the internet for a while, it's the other way around. And this is called audience capture. So and this is kind of like um, one of the complaints or sources of tension for people who are online often and creating is that they feel like they're on this treadmill of creation, of content creation. They're being influenced by whatever their audience, their fear of criticism, of wanting to get validated in a certain way, whatever egregore is capturing them. So it's the other people influences the second self, and the second self influences the IRL self, maybe enslaves it. And the classic case of audience capture is Nicholas Perry. I don't know if you're familiar with this. He was just kind of a skinny dude, and then he got into something called mukbang. And then he was basically audience captured, and his audience was pressuring him to eat all this food, and he started eating all this food for his platform. Then he became overtly obese, and he had like all these health issues and stuff like that. I think he lost weight recently, but this is that like the cardinal case of audience capture, like the nightmare scenario of what could happen if you get captured by your quote unquote audience. Um, and this is something more commonly experienced. This is a slide from one of Yancey Strickler's recent presentations on MetaLabel. So, you post on a platform, whatever it is, YouTube, Twitter, Substack, you get likes and subs, you get a high from that. You build some kind of audience on that platform. It creates pressure to create more content. You get burnt out. And it's like there's something very quite sensitive with the creative when you start something in a very creative spirit, you don't know what you're going to create. There's a sense of aliveness there. But then when there's like that pressure to create once a week, or especially when it's tethered to your livelihood, then you start creating things that are like kind of like, is this really something that excites me, something that I'm in integrity with? And you get bent in very subtle ways. And that leads to the burnout. And then you kind of like you're concerned about your mental health. And it's like, okay, I'll go on a hiatus, I'll take a break. And then you're back on the treadmill. So how do you escape? How do you escape this? That's the question a lot of us are wrestling with. Um, this performance that we don't want to, or this like play that we don't want to perform in. Um, and I'm no expert at second selfing, but this is something that's at the edge of my thinking. But I'll tell you a little bit my journey. I really started getting online. I started like creating online about 2018, but then became extremely online, like a lot of people during the pandemic started in 2020. And I kind of came out as a stoic. And I'm like, you know what? I'll write to myself. every day, like Marcus Aurelius. So I kind of LARPed as a stoic who writes to himself, and I'm like, hey, and I'll also create the Stoa. And for those who don't know, the Stoa came, or the Stoics came from the name the Stoa Pocaeli, because a bunch of philosophers were sitting at the Stoa, and that's how they got the name the Stoics. So then my platform, my podcast, the event space, whatever this is, was called the Stoa. Um, and this was like a transformative experience. It was wild. This was during peak Stoa, peak pandemic, and this is Zeno, the actual founder of Stoicism. And this is myself during peak Stoa, and it was you can't tell them apart really. These two images, and I can attest that I wouldn't say I became more wise, but I feel like I definitely became more foolish, more mature during this second selfing, LARPing as a Stoic. But a lot of weird stuff happened as well. A lot of like spiritual stuff, um, which made me just want to back off this sort of like second selfing feedback loop. And so people who follow my work know I'm not as active as I once was a couple of years ago. Um, and partly is there's this concept called bleed. So if you're familiar with the LARP scene, live action role playing, there's people like go in the woods and they pretend they're knights, and Nordic LARP is a certain type of LARP that's really sophisticated, and they have all these different types of kind of role playing, and they have this term called bleed. So bleed, and I'll read you a passage from the Nordic LARP Whippy. So, bleed is experienced by a performer when her thoughts and feelings are influenced by those of her character or vice versa. People refer to bleed when it is the player's emotional state that affects the character. For example, a scared player may lead to a character that is jumpy, nervous, overtly cautious. Bleed out is used to refer to bleed in the other direction. Here, the character's inner state is affected by the performer. So, and this is I reported often when people are kind of like engaging this LARPs. It's like the character starts influencing them, and if you play that character often, your real self, whatever that is, gets transformed. Um, so, given everything presented already, if you have that kind of that negative feedback loop, if you will, if an audience captures you, especially if it's an audience that might not like you or it's not the wisest audience, and then you might bleed in ways that are not in your best interest. Um, and so the general advice is take care in how you bleed. That's the advice I'd leave with. And tips for second selfing. Stop being addicted to whatever platform you're posting on. That's number one. And that's probably the only tip that one needs. Um, this is controversial, but consider hiding comments and likes. I get a lot of like criticism, flack for this, for hiding comments at the YouTube channel. But I think it helps avoid audience capture for me, or at least it makes it less salient. And I engage in like these U blocker things that can block the likes. So I just don't pay attention to that stuff. Uh, Engage with dark forests. This is a term that Yancey Strickler popularized, and I'm part of this thing called this Dark Forest Collective. Um, so Dark Forest is interacts with Web 2.0, all these social media, but they kind of cohere in these private spaces, often non-recorded, non-indexed in search engines, like we're doing right now. So the Stoa is really a dark forest, and the more you engage in dark forest, I think the more healthy versions of second selfing can emerge. And then, yeah, use the internet to find the others, because I think the internet's a wonderful tool for that. And then cohere in real life, which is not, any new advice there. Uh, so yeah, that's my presentation. I think it complements Catherine's quite well. So I'll pause there. Um, and yeah, if anyone has any, I think we'll go into like a brief breakout room to just kind of break it up, and then we can talk to people. But Catherine and I, let's maybe have an exchange between us if anything came up for you in presenting or hearing my presentation that you feel called to share.
Yeah, one question I have is what does it really mean to be addicted, especially if you're in the performer role? I think it's very easy to slide into this idea of like, oh, it's just a validation cycle. Um, but I don't think we talk about like the deeper things that people might really want. Um, is it just like you're so great, you're so awesome, or are they trying to use their status as an influencer to get something else? Um, Maybe it's money. I think that's actually not quite as common, but is it access to something? And why is that something so important to, do like what Nicholas Perry did and become Nikado Avocado and eat himself, probably to death eventually, right? Like what are people really searching for?
One thought with addiction, and this is not just to being addicted to like doing things online, just like could be anything, eating, uh, and or smoking or whatever. And I find when I was sort of addicted to something in the past, there's just like kind of impulsive thing that actually I didn't feel like I had agency. I just like I had to do it, and there's like a felt sense of just being compelled with and knowing it's not good for me. And then overcoming some kind of quote unquote addictions. I'm not even sure I'm using the medical term right there, but I'm just using it as a placeholder for that impulsive thing that you shouldn't be doing. And then being on the other side of addictions, it just you feel more in control. And so I could be wrong, but my argument is that like you can still perform without having that impulsiveness, and I think you'll have greater agency on how you perform. Um, and so that's one share, and then the other share is uh, what was it? Uh, yeah, it slipped my mind at the moment, but yeah, I'm curious if you have anything on that the addiction part, Catherine.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think in it's impulsive, and you get tunnel vision, but it's really interesting to think of addiction through the lens of someone who's putting like a great deal of effort to put together like a video, right? Like mukbang videos are so many steps, there's so much production involved. Whereas when we like traditionally think of social media addiction, it's like swiping, like you can't stop swiping. It's some kind of like compulsive thing. We really want people to leave us comments. We want people to say you're so great. Um, but I wonder what kind of like currency a lot of this translates into for people, or if it's like they are because the other option, and I think this is what we're discussing largely in our presentations, is it's sort of a form of world building, and we're exiting like it's not so much addiction, it's a defiance to live in another place, to live on the stage, as opposed to go out into the physical world, or even to the dark forest where no one can see us.
Yeah, and yeah, recall what I wanted to share, which is related. So I really like this piece that Venkatesh Rao, who's also part of the Dark Forest Collective. He wrote on basically this like taxonomy on different types of creators online. And I think he was referring to writing, but I think you can just refer to it like kind of like the second self as a whole. And the main kind of distinction was like people who create content for instrumental purposes, and people who do it for more like you can say pure, but just like artistic purposes. They just have this desire to create. Which sometimes when I get into that creative state, that flow like state almost feels addictive, but I would say it's qualitatively different. Um, and and yeah, it's like the people who are creating instrumentally, I think what term this German philosopher called it prophilicity. It's like it's kind of like you can tell when someone is just creating content to like hype themselves up, to build an audience, to make money, to like sell something, which has a different quality than some of the people who are approaching content creation, their second self even as more of an art form. So I think that is a helpful thing when we're looking at this phenomenon of internet being a stage and second selfing. Is it like someone's just consciously using their second self and their content to get something like money or fame, or is it someone doing something just for pure expression and artistic expression? Um, I had a question for you, Catherine. Was there any you have any follow-up shares with that one? No. Um, so yeah, I imagine my question will return, but if anyone has any questions or thoughts, feel free to just raise your hand, emoji hand, or any shares, and we can do that. Uh, Clinton, I'm a fan of your work, Clinton, by the way, so it's good to have you at the STOA.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Appreciate that. Uh, y- your use of the term white space is very interesting, Catherine, because it sort of implies this blankness of the background or this lack of positively defined present substance, right? It's a real cool media, as in McLuhan's terms, if you like, the way that you can only world build in the absence of something already being there, right? You need a blank canvas to do your world building, or you need a sort of ignorance within which to fill in whatever it is you're making up about your second self. So I was wondering if you think that the work you do in digging up old history, say from Tumblr and whatnot, old internet history, is sort of an attempt to ground people in a tradition that they don't know that they're living in, to sort of fill in the white space and tell them, no, this is what you've been doing, and these are who your people were that you weren't around then. For instance, Peter, you said you got big into content creation in 2018, right? I mean, on the historical scale, this people started getting online in droves in the late 80s, right? So how much is your history work, Catherine, a trying to give people a tether to the actual world, to sort of give them a frame or an arch for them to know the stage that they're presenting in?
It's a little bit of that, but even the problem with the internet is it's really hard to fill in that white space. I think it's almost impossible. Um, some of it is to see how things have evolved and to help ground people, but not it's too difficult because I think that a lot of the context when we're speaking is um, and things like tone is sort of impossible to recapture. Like the internet more than any, I don't know if it's more than any other medium, but the internet in particular, um, you really like had to have been there, and that's a huge problem. That's why internet history is so difficult and why people get it wrong. I think people get history wrong all the time, and regardless what medium they're working in, but you really, really get it wrong because there's so many things that you can't see, that you can't bring back. There's like it. I don't think we have any more documentation now than we did. Like a good example is, let's say you're looking at a forum thread. What you're missing so much, like what was going on in the DMs to know like what the mood was. What were people saying on IRC, or what were the relationships behind the scene? And especially online, like what people literally say isn't always what they mean. So you could have a forum, for example, where everyone is saying some variation on, the example I always use is "I hate women" because it's so extreme. And "I hate women" might be like a literal declaration that they hate women, but it also might be a slang term that means something else. It might be a form of gatekeeping. Um, there's so many different things it can mean. It might be a sort of weird role play that's happening. Um, and often when we go and try to figure out, well, what were they actually talking about? What was the mood? What did people mean? It's so difficult to know unless you interview multiple people who are there at the same time. Um, so yeah, I think the project of grounding people is a little bit impossible, sadly.
And Peter, if I may, thank you, Catherine. Uh, this idea of creator stadiums, of sort of this rare exceptional case where the content creator or the e-celeb has such a self-security that they are one way projecting their persona onto their audience, and yet they're sort of immune from the feedback that would have them drown in the mass of their audience participation. That sounds a lot like old school Hollywood celebrity problems, or what musicians go through today. Like the classic example would be like Marilyn Monroe or Elvis Presley for boomers or something, right? But I mean, if you look at Kanye West, even, right, like the way celebrities go crazy, more or less, lose themselves in the in the fame and the way that they all have, these resources of publicity agents and high paid therapists to help them work through these issues, or then in Kanye West's example, get exploited by the people who are being, who they're paying to help them, as Milo Yiannopoulos' recent reporting has revealed. These are celebrities with millions of dollars and all the best professional help to try and help them stay stable in the limelight. How do we as individuals, what's the challenge for random people like you and I compared to what historically celebrities have dealt with in the past when their image is amplified electrically?
And what is the question for the kind of like people like you and I? Like, how do we?
Yeah. Is there a difference or is there a similarity between the problems that regular people have with their second selves on the internet compared to the audience or the surround of comments compared to what a traditional celebrity has with the backing of Hollywood and with money, because we don't have those resources.
Yeah, yeah. The term just the creator stadiums. I was sort of repurposing it a little bit, but it was just originally meant to just describe someone with a large platform broadcasting a message one way. But that doesn't mean they're not being influenced by their audience, or they have the potential to get audience captured. Probably most people have creator stadiums are audience captured um, via the comments, the likes and all that type of stuff. Uh, and Yeah, and I think the traditional celebrities, there's a lot more gatekeepers there, a lot more kind of machinations behind the scenes to control their persona, where there's more of there's less of that, obviously for people who want to create a second self like us. Um, but yeah, to answer your question directly, we're kind of in the wild west of the psychological harm that comes from that. And I think this is what this session, or at least my motivation to have this session, is to kind of like address, sense into. Because one of the healthy tension points that Katherine and I had when we were talking about this previously is that like she wants to double down on the internet, maybe transform it, maybe kind of like have a more like a web 1.5. I don't know if I'm mischaracterizing what you said, Katherine, but like you're more positive about the internet's future. And there's a part of me that's like that too, but I just kind of like want to get off. And so I'm like, get off the internet completely. I want to like just I want to be able to like live on a farm, do all this type of stuff. And I'm buying into those like, the memes that are like supporting that and like, and so that's where my kind of temperament is right now. And I think this is a reaction really to touching on the kind of like the unhealthy aspects of the internet in the last three years. And not being able to fully appreciate like the fruits and the wealth of like contacts and people and beautiful experiences and also money that the internet has brought me from creating. It's like I'm downplaying that in my mind, just focusing on the negative aspect. So yeah, I think we're in the wild west of figuring that out, Clinton. Yeah, thanks for your question, Jeremy.
Hey, so this is a conversation I've given a lot of thought to, especially with that kind of Hollywood. Like, are we dealing with the same kind of audience capture in daily lives online as Hollywood, or with addiction? Like, where's that line? And so, a way that's helpful for me to think about it is our online selves are like ego states, right? So that's a psychoanalytic term that John and Helen Watkins, who are hypnotists and psychoanalysts, really popularized. And it's very commonly used in therapies now, like EMDR. So I do EMDR therapy. I'm a therapist by trade. And when someone dissociates or experiences trauma in the moment, they can often uh, go into like another self or create that. And so I see the second self as like that kid, like they're being mocked in class, they become a class clown, they get reinforced for that, they create this kind of flat self. So when we look at, is something an addiction or is it unhealthy, we can see like how flat is it? Is someone only able to respond with humor? Because we always find it annoying. We find people who can only joke all the time annoying because we know there's supposed to be something else there. And so to me, like the question of how healthy is this versus unhealthy? Well, is this something that is the only identity this person is dissociating and pouring their efforts into? And I think like with Nakata Avocado, we see like, wow, you're only eating, like you're eating so much that you're literally being unhealthy versus maybe doing some lighter mukbangs and putting some other stuff in there. So like, and it's dissociation is normal. We do it when we're driving on the highway. We don't remember how we got there, but there seems to be a predilection for that dopamine hit and that ability to, or rather the inability to pull away from investing in that second self for some people. And you see that in the article, the really good recommended reading from Sherry Turkle, is it's like some people seem sucked into the point that they're curating this self and it's sucking all the energy from their real one. I'm wondering if that's something that y'all resonate with or see it like there's a cost to be paid there for that, the time. That's the biggest thing.
I mean, I wonder like which one is the real one too. I think that's a more complicated question. I mean, you mentioned it as a coping mechanism, and I think that's sometimes true. But I also think there's this idea of like the emotional truth of how you present online.
Right.
There's a story I like tell all the time now, but it like really got me thinking and sort of changed the way I thought about online presentation. Someone reached out to me and they liked my writing, they wanted to be friends, and I was briefly friends with this person. I talked to them quite a bit. And over time, it became clear that they had lied about basically everything about their identity. But I knew what they looked like. It wasn't a straightforward like catfish. And what was interesting is I felt like the lie was actually more true in a lot of ways than who they really were. And each lie that they told me was sort of symbolic of something that both they wanted to happen, but also they wanted to express about themselves, but couldn't online. And it made a sort of a bigger splash than just the mundane details of their lives. And there's like one way to look at this person, like he's trapped in a fiction or, like whatever. But there's another way. It's like they're using the internet to accurately communicate something about their personality or something about their soul. And unfortunately, it has to be through deception.
What came for me up is the kind of the dopamine aspect. So this is from a Substack, the Honest Broker. This is like the state of the whatever is the state of culture, and he's basically saying that entertainment is eating art, and that was kind of been happening for a while. But he said this is what's it's not actually not entertainment what's happening on the internet. It's like distraction, like the TikTok culture. It's like distractions eating entertainment and eating art. And then he goes a step further. It's like addiction is eating distraction, eating entertainment, eating art. And so you can agree with this, disagree with this, but he calls it the dopamine culture that we're all hooked on. And I'm sympathetic to this framing and going back into this sort of like second self as a LARP. That has a bleed aspect. It bleeds into your real self. And going back to the Stoic aspect that I'm LARPing. So Stoic is all about virtue. And then the cardinal virtues are practical wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. And so temperance is kind of like having the right balance of what to engage with and what not to engage with. And so I think the internet is just like one huge temperance training, like a grounds, like a gym. And so I think like there's an opportunity space, not to kind of just demonize, oh, it's distraction, addiction. It's like there's an opportunity space to get more spiritual, get more philosophical in the practical way. Jeremy, do you have any follow-up on that, or shall we move to the?
No, I love that. I think I just wonder so much what those people are now in Sherry Turkle's article, right? Like if they were able to pull away or if they became sucked into MySpace, Facebook, and went on this trajectory. There's something I've noticed is very interesting is in my field, we're going from a focus on just behavior. It was all behaviorism, CBT, diagnosis, what's observable. And now people like Peterson and others focusing on virtues, like what you're talking about, like virtue ethics, and that being a guiding sort of heuristic is really catching on. I think it's because of the fact that there's these very simplistic, like dopamine capture mechanisms. And when people are getting burned out from that, they're trying to find something else there. And my question is like, what if someone only ever cultivate a fake self, like in their feedback loop slides, like it's like, the problem is like your real self, second self. Well, with Gen Alpha, what time are they going to have to cultivate that real self that they can then unplug from and get and go back, that they can unplug from the second self and go back to?
And I guess the way I look at it is like, how do we know which self is the real self? And it depends on even like the context on in which you're behaving online, right? I don't think it's as easy of a question. Um, I think for some people, like maybe their internet self is their real or true self. When you're getting into like more explicit performance aspects, like with an influencer or a YouTuber or whatever, and they're getting too sucked into the self that sells the video. I think that's a different thing, but I don't think every person who uses the internet is selling something in quite the same way.
Yeah, I'm gonna maybe for the group discussion, I'll leave that tension. What is the real self? Like that provocative statement. Thanks for the question, Hal. Go with you next.
Yeah, no, the movie The Century of the Self, if you haven't seen it, the Adam Curtis one starts with Freud and it ends with sort of 90s tabloid culture. It ends with the grandson Matthew Freud. And of course, tabloids, you have a distinct celebrity persona, and people paid a lot of attention to that. This was the age of stage managed celebrities. But also, in the sense, in that age, there was this sort of idea of like, you have sort of, if you're really following a celebrity closely, you know everything about them in this sort of like semi official way. Everything is sort of canonical in a way that I think in the era of digital, the fact that things can be edited and things can be changed, it's such a, I mean, obviously, like tabloids, even compared to other media, like if you say aspire to be similar to a philosopher or something like that, like Stoa or something like that, you have a canon of things you can go after. Whereas the internet, there is no canon of distinct truths. You can't go back in time and see, like, this is what it was like to be an ex internet situation because it's different for everyone and everyone's experience is different. And that the most interesting thing related to the Turkle article with this was the whole idea that the internet is a space for postmodernism as opposed to a modernist sort of like tabloid production or some kind of linear media. My question, and I really have thought a lot about this, and it really matters to me, is what convinces people and makes them, like, I guess, self-confident, arrogant enough that they're able to bring forward their online persona into the real world in a way that is just totally not convincing. So someone is able to online LARP as wealthy, a different sex, just something, and then in the real world they actually, their brain turns to the idea of, well, I actually can appear as this, and it never is convincing. And the question is, why are people so entranced with the image they've created for themselves that they think that they can actually pull it off and then demand that other people think that it's real? It's very bizarre to me in that way, that people can think that people will not have any judgment of their opinion.
It is. I mean, I think that's one of the fundamental tensions, like how you wish to be seen and how people see you. And again, this obviously isn't new, but it's like so much more. It's so much more of a tension point right now. I mean, there's many different answers to this. I think sort of like more like esoterically, it's for some people, I think it's literally a form of attempting to do magic, like a form of manifestation. This idea, like fake it until you make it, is really ingrained in American culture. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is it is it is true to them, right? And even if it's not convincing, a lot of these roles are like so untethered from experience because they have sort of an affinity towards it, and they have this strong attraction to whatever it means to them. They don't understand, they're not convincing. And it's a little bit difficult to explain. But let's say take the idea of like someone who is like LARPing as trad, right? And they aren't trad. There's something about like what trad means to them and what it says about who they are, um, that sort of, again, like very like nebulous like vibe or affinity or attraction overrules the experience aspect, because either way, they're not living out any action. So there's not a lot of these people have like very sedentary lives. So there's nothing there's the type of tension they experience with like true and false is very different. And I don't know if I explained that clearly at all. So feel free for anyone asking me follow-up questions.
Well, I'll tag on to that because I'm really glad Catherine brought up the magic element. I'm going to use magic with a K, and I think it's a helpful perspective to look at the second selfing. And I think it might answer your question, or at least gesture towards it, how. Um, so there's this term discovered from Grant Morrison. He's a comic book writer. He called it the hypersigil. So a sigil is just like, if those are familiar with magic with a K, it's just like a circle, and they have all these lines that you take a statement, then you charge it, and then it manifests some kind of reality. So like a chaos magic way to bring about something that you desire. And then a hypersigil is that done through narrative, done through a story. And then Grant Morrison, he's a comic book writer, and then in one of his comics, The Invisibles, he wrote him kind of like, didn't call it himself, but he like wrote the character as himself. It looked like him, it had similar personalities. And then the character in the graphic novel went through all this crazy stuff, all these like kind of like sexcapades and all these like adventures. And then it started happening to him in real life. The stuff that his character was going through, that he wrote it. And so then he coined the term hypersigil, like the narrative that he gave his character was actually bleeding into his own life. So you can say that he created a second self, and it was an effective spell. Um, so if you want to look at the lens of magic, some spells are effective, some are not, some just don't work. So maybe the ones that don't translate, if I understood your question, how translate into real life, is just where they were impotent spell casting.
Someone needs to do a taxonomy of all the different things or ways people present themselves on the internet and what types of spell this is, like if it's transfiguration, charms, etc. But I'm sure some other people have something more interesting to say.
Yeah. And so at the top of the hour, people can like skip out if they need to, but then we're going to turn off the record button and do like a more group inquiry, less of a Q&A. But we'll have maybe one more question. Joe, I saw your hand up previously. And Joe is if you don't know Joe, Joe's an amazing artist, and all the Stoa intros are thanks to this man, the best part of the Stoa. So thank you, Joe.
Yeah. Well, my question, Peter, was about what you said you wanted to lob up for the breakout a little bit about like what is real. So I don't need to sort of mine that at the moment, but I do think it's a really sort of potent inquiry in terms of like the second self we present. And I can already tell there's a sort of tension, as you noted in the chat, of like, well, what is real insofar as our bodies and our emotions and our what's real here and what's real there, and the way those sort of collide or collaborate. So there's not really a question there other than that was something that sort of sparked some thoughts in me.
Cool. Yeah, so I think that's a good statement to weave into the inquiry. Catherine, and I'm going to put people in breakout rooms just to kind of like connect over a question, a prompt, and then when we come back, then we can open up to the group. But any final shares to close this portion?
No, I think I'm ready for the breakout room.
All right. So I'm going to turn off the record button. If you feel like